Thank you, sister. 2 Kings chapter 2, if you'd find it with me this evening. 2 Kings chapter 2. I'll try not to take long with this, but I would be amiss if I did not say one more time, thank you, Dr. Ellis, for the great privilege of being here, being in this meeting in this place and with these people. And I have thoroughly enjoyed myself, and it has been such an honor, been such a delight. And I know that I say that everywhere I go, but I actually mean it this time. It has been wonderful. And I don't think that the significance of the place and all of that is really going to hit me till after I leave. But it has just been wonderful. And thank you so much for your hospitality and your generosity, and you've been so kind. And Brother Chamberlain and the church, the work that has been put into hosting this, and my hat's off to you and to your church, and thank you so much for everything that you've done. And I would tell you, I would be honest with you, I think everything has been wonderful. I have sat here and I have delighted in the preaching. I have loved it. And the music has been superb. Every service just has touched my heart and anointed. And I mean, every part of this meeting, for me, has just been a delight. And what an honor, what a privilege. I'm going to try to say just a few things, give you a couple little thoughts tonight, get out of the way of Brother Gravely, let him have the service tonight. But 2 Kings chapter number 2, let me begin reading in verse number 11, if you would. 2 Kings 2, verse number 11. It came to pass as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elisha went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes, then rent them into pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and smote the waters, and said, where is the Lord God of Elijah? When he also had smitten the waters, they parted hither and thither, and Elisha went over. 1st and 2nd Kings are two of my favorite books to preach from. I've probably preached from those two books more than any other book that I haven't preached through systematically. 2 Kings chapter 2 is probably my favorite chapter in all of the Bible to preach. It is truly a preacher's delight. There are 4 different scenes in this chapter. They all revolve around Elijah's last day on earth. In this chapter, Elijah's caught up this chariot of fire and caught up in a whirlwind, and the mantle of ministry falls upon Elisha, that younger prophet. So it marks the end of one man's ministry and the beginning of another man's ministry. So there's principles here for the old and for the young, and there's a pattern for the inevitable transfer of leadership and ministry that every church, every ministry will eventually face. I have preached a number of times from the first section of these verses that I did not read, and I have preached several times on the places that you must visit before you go home. This is Elijah's last day on earth, and somehow he knows it. And so on this last day on earth, he chooses to spend it revisiting 4 places that have national and historical and spiritual significance in the nation of Israel. He doesn't do anything there. He doesn't preach. He doesn't prophesy. He doesn't perform any miracles, but it's just more of a reminiscent tour than anything else. The first place that he visits is Gilgal. Gilgal represents deliverance. That's the first place that Israel came to when they crossed over the Jordan River. The word Gilgal means a rolling away, and Joshua named it Gilgal because he said that this is where the reproach of Egypt has been rolled away. So he revisits the place where the reproach was rolled away. If you have never been to the place where the reproach of sin was rolled away, you're not ready to go home. The second place he visits is the place Bethel. Bethel represents denial. That's the first place where Jacob encountered God, the first time that he said, I want you to be my God and my Lord. It's the place of self-denial and surrender for a man who would have many places of self-denial after that. But it represents where we take our hands off of our life and say that I'm willing to surrender to your will. And if you've never been to a place of denial of self and surrender, then you're not ready to go home. The third place that he visits is Jericho. Jericho represents for me a place of diligence. Jericho was the place of first victory in the land. It is the first battle and the first victory in the promised land. And do you know how it was accomplished? They marched around a wall. And the next day they marched around the wall. And the next day they did the same thing again. And the next day they just found out what God wanted them to do, and they just kept doing that. That's diligence. And if you've never learned the secret of self-discipline, to read your Bible every day and to pray every day and to walk in the Spirit every day in that diligent life, then you're not ready to go home. The last place that he visits is Jordan, and Jordan represents daunting faith. Jordan is that second great parting of the water. There's the Red Sea and there's the parting of the Jordan River. But the difference is that in the Jordan, the priest had to actually step his foot into the water before the water would part. That's a daunting step of faith. You take it and just see if God's going to do anything. But you won't know until you take that daunting step of faith. And if you've never attempted anything big, if you've never tried the impossible, if you've never acted on faith on something that had to have God to intervene, then you're not ready to go home. I love preaching that passage, places you must visit before you go home. There's a scene at the latter end of the chapter. I preached it on what to expect after the rapture, the story of Elijah being caught up in the whirlwind, and he goes to heaven without seeing death. And we won't have chariots of fire, but perhaps some of you and I will escape death and we'll see heaven through the rapture. But the Bible also tells us something of the chaos that the world is going to be thrust into when millions of Christians suddenly disappear from the earth, and there is a small picture of that in this chapter. Because when Elijah is raptured into heaven, the first thing that happens is there is pandemonium to find those who are missing people. They become very unsettled about him being gone, and they want to organize a search party for him. And Elisha says, go ahead, you're not going to find him because I know he's gone. And one of these days, millions are going to disappear, and the world's going to demand an answer amidst the chaos and the confusion. The other thing that happens is there's a passive explanation that is widely received. They organize a search party, and it's interesting to me that they search for 3 days. And do you know what they do after 3 days? Nothing. The disappearance of Elijah is never mentioned again after those 3 days. And after the rapture takes place, somebody's going to come along with an explanation, and soon life is going to go on, and people will forget about it, and the world will just keep on turning, and somebody will come up with an explanation, and the world will blindly accept it. But then in this story, there is a purposeful rejection of God's man. It is strange that after this rapture of Elijah, that it's right after that Elisha goes into that town and he's mocked by those children that mock him for being bald. Israel never accepted Elijah's preaching. They're not going to like Elisha's either. And they mocked him and they said, go up, thou bald man. Here's what I think they're saying: go up like he did. Just go ahead and go away and disappear. And we don't need you. And one day, every preacher of the gospel is going to disappear from the earth, and God's going to send just 2 witnesses. And do you know what the world's going to do to those 2 preachers? They're going to kill them and leave them laying in the street. So there's a small picture of what happens after the rapture. I love preaching from this chapter. But I'm interested tonight in the most significant scene, and that is the disappearance of Elijah and the transfer of ministry to Elisha. Elijah is gone and Elisha is taking his place. And the ministry that Elijah leaves to Elisha is represented by a mantle. A mantle would be like a sleeveless coat, kind of like a vest that would go over all of the other garments. And Elijah lays it down, and Elisha picks it up, and it is symbolic of carrying on the same ministry that Elijah had. It is not just an article of clothing, but it speaks of a calling. It speaks of an anointing. When Elijah gives him that mantle, he is basically saying that I'm choosing you to become my disciple, and I want you to carry on the ministry that I have started. And when Elijah has departed and that mantle has dropped, it means that Elijah's ministry has come to an end. And there are so many times that an older man has been ready to go home and lay the mantle down, but there was nobody to pick the mantle up. There's been many great men who have pastored the church for 20, 30, 40 years, and that church thrived when that older man was around. But now those churches are dead, or they're on life support because there was nobody to pick the mantle up. I know older men right now who are looking for a younger man to come in and to take the church, somebody that could come in and to pick up their mantle. And there's men that are young men that are looking for a job and for a salary. But where is the young man with the anointing, the young man with the touch of God, the one man that is spirit-filled, that won't take the church contemporary, that won't go in a new direction? How is it that we have more empty Baptist churches than we have available pastors to fill that pulpit? I wonder if somebody's not answering the call. And so that's why it's encouraging to me for Elijah to have somebody to leave the mantle to, because it means that his ministry is not over. It means that the work is going to go on. It means that the church won't die. It means that somebody will still be preaching when he's gone. You know, there's been many men who gave their mantle to a younger man who turned it over to somebody else, and that younger man didn't wear that mantle as well. I could name, and you could as well, ministries and colleges and churches and children's homes that thrived when the older man was around, but now they're a shell of what they used to be, or they're gone completely, and too often the work suffers, or the church goes in decline, or the property is sold off. When the older man leaves the scene, who will pick up the mantle, and who will carry the mantle as well as the older generation? What is so great about the story of Elijah and Elisha is that Elisha didn't do just the works that Elijah did, but he did greater works than Elijah did. In these books, there are 7 named miracles that Elijah did. There are 14 named miracles that Elisha did. And every older preacher wants to see the work go on, and he wants to see the work do even greater works than when he was alive. And so who picks up the mantle when the old preacher passes, and not just pick it up, but pick it up and do even greater works than the older man did? I'll give you just a couple of thoughts tonight from this story, and then I'll be done. I want to say, first of all, that when I look at the transfer of leadership and ministry, my first thought is that every ministry has an expiration point. I hope that you won't misunderstand this. I have nobody in mind. But there are some times in a church or a ministry where the pastor or the leader stays on longer than he should. Maybe they think that they have more time left than they do. Or it's hard to face the reality of failing health and age that is creeping up. And when you've poured your life into a ministry for 20, 30, 40 years, and it has been every breath that you've had, and you poured your sweat and blood and toil in it, boy, it's hard to let go. And sometimes men lose their energy and their strength, but the unknown of what is the younger man going to do to this ministry? How's he going to can he handle the ministry? Sometimes they stay longer because there's just nobody else to take it. And the work can flounder when there is no plan for that inevitable day of transfer. Did you know some men make the mistake of thinking that their life and their ministry is over long before God is through with them? Sometimes they turn in too early. In Genesis chapter 27, Isaac told Esau that he was about to die. He was at death's doorstep. Did you know that he lived 30 years after that? David said in 1 Samuel 20, he said, there is but a step between me and death. He missed it by 46 years. Wasn't even close. John Wesley wrote his epitaph at 32, lived to be 88. So you might have a lot of time left. It might be your last day. It might not be your last day. But every ministry inevitably has an expiration date. Elijah has stood before kings, and he has prophesied to both kingdoms, and he's challenged the priesthood of the entire state religion. And Elijah could pray and stop the rain for 3.5 years, and he could pray and fire come down from heaven, and he could pray and raise a widow's son from the dead. And the world had never seen a man like Elijah. He's one of the few men in the Bible to which no sin is attributed. I know that he did sin, but the Bible doesn't record any, and he leaves with a sterling testimony. His reputation is intact. Thank God for that. I've been privileged to pastor Victory Baptist Church now for 27 years. And I'll be honest with you, I can't help sometimes but wonder, how long am I supposed to be here? Is God through with me? And the way that I am, anytime that our church goes through a little lull in growth, I wonder, have I taken it as far as I can? Should I step aside and let somebody else come in with more vim and vigor and more ability, and maybe they can take the church to heights that I'm not able to? I don't want to leave before it's my time, before God's done with me, but I sure don't want to overstay my allotted time. There's been quite a few people in my church that thought it was my time to go, but I'm trying to wait to hear from the Lord. And if the Lord allows, I'd like to die there. I'd like to finish in that pulpit, but I leave it in God's hands. But I'd sure like to go out like Elijah. I'd sure like to go out with my testimony unblemished. And when my ministry reaches the expiration point, I pray that I've kept my hand to the plow and I've kept my eyes on Jesus. But every ministry has an expiration point. Here's the second thought. Every Elijah hopes for an Elisha. You see, when you are young and you're just starting out in ministry, you don't think of a succession plan. You men that are on deputation and just getting your foot in the door of some prison, you're not thinking about who's going to take my place when I'm too old to go. But as you get older and you can see the end of the road somewhat, and those thoughts begin to enter your mind. Who's going to take over when I'm through? Who am I going to turn this over to? And who's going to step into my place and pastor this church when I'm done? And no pastor wants to see the work done less. I pray that the man who takes my place, I pray that he's stronger than I, and I pray he's a better preacher than I, and I pray that he builds a bigger church, because my children and my grandchildren go to that church, and I want him to have the power of God on him more than I did. My family needs that. Our hopes so often go beyond our own usefulness. Oh, hold your finger right here. Come to 1 Kings 19, just a couple of chapters back. Let me show you something. 1 Kings chapter 19, and look at verse number 15. And the Lord said unto him, this is to Elijah, go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Hey, wait a minute. Syria already had a king. But God was thinking about the next king. Look at verse 16. And Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. Israel already had a king. But that king would not last forever, and God's thinking about the next king. He says again in verse 16, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. Israel already had a prophet. But God was thinking about the next prophet. And every preacher at some time begins to think about who is next. But every older preacher knows that I can't turn the ministry over to just any young man that applies. And thank God for every young man that comes out of Bible college with a lot of youthful zeal. But can I say, you're not tested yet. You're still trying to know what you know. Too many times you're coming out and you don't know who you're going to listen to and what books you're going to read and which direction you're going to go. And many older men have turned that work over to a younger man that they thought would keep it straight, but then they took that church in a new direction. But every Elijah hopes for an Elisha that can come along and to take the ministry to new heights without leaving the old paths. What does it take? Come back to 2 Kings 2. Look, if you would, in verse number 9. It came to pass when they were gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, what shall I do for thee before I be taken away from thee? And Elisha said, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. He said, thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee, but if not, it shall not be so. Do you know what it takes to carry on a ministry? It takes desire. But not just desire, it takes resolve. And if you don't have that fire in your belly, it won't matter who picks you. It won't matter how slick and smooth you are. It won't matter what kind of talent that you have. Desire and resolve will get you through the hard times. Desire and resolve will get you going when everybody else says that you ought to quit. And every young preacher has the desire, but do you have the resolve? Elijah passed that mantle to Elisha because I think he saw in him something that he didn't see in the other sons of the prophets. Look back in verse number 1. Came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And Elijah said unto Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel. Elisha is following Elijah around that last day, and Elijah is in Gilgal, and Elijah says, young man, I'm going to go over to Bethel, and it's a few miles over, and you've gone far enough. Why don't you just stay here? I'm going to go on to Bethel. Listen to what he said. Elisha said to him, as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. I'm not leaving. You can't get rid of me that easy. And I think that Elijah was testing him. I think he was seeing, is there resolve in him that he doesn't see in the other sons of the prophets? He says in verse number 4, Elijah said unto him, Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. Hey, you've been with me half the day, but I'm going to go to Jericho. It's a little bit farther. Why don't you stay here? And Elisha said, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. I'm not quitting. I'm going to go as far as you go. It says in verse number 6, Elijah said unto him, tarry, I pray thee here, for the Lord has sent me to Jordan. You're proving yourself you've gone far enough. Why don't you just stay here? And Elisha said, as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. I'm not leaving you. I'm going as far as you go. I'm going all the way. And I believe that Elijah's testing his resolve. And I believe that there is something that rises up in the heart of Elijah to say that, but boy, he's got something that the other sons of the prophets don't have. I say that in the ministry, God will test your resolve. God will send you a church member that will test your resolve. God will let somebody start a Twitter page dedicated to criticizing you to test your resolve. And you'll have a lot of cheerleaders at the beginning, but those cheerleaders will eventually turn to critics. And you'll get mad and you want to spew and spout and want to tweet back. Maybe God is just testing your resolve. And I know that you want the ministry, but do you have the resolve? And you may have a desire to be used of God, but do you have what it takes to not quit and to not let go and to not give in? I wish I could say that it gets easier, but it doesn't. That the first step is the hardest step, but it's not. That everybody that says that they stand behind you will, but they won't. That the encouragement at the beginning only gets louder the farther you go along. That's not true. There's going to be long hours and sleepless nights and bitter betrayals and loose women to try to seduce you and men with money to try to control you. And if you don't have the resolve that says no matter what comes my way, I'm going all the way with Jesus, you're not going to make it. When you have carnal friends to discourage you and disloyal associates to betray you and lies and smear campaigns to discredit you and half-truths told to dishonor you and your best friends bail out when you need them the most, but it could be that God's just testing your resolve. Elisha, you've gone to Gilgal. You don't have to come to Bethel anymore. And I think that Elijah's hoping that Elisha says, no, I'm going with you. I think in his heart that he hopes that Elisha is different from the rest. Elisha, you've been to Bethel and you don't have to come to Jericho. Elisha, you've proven yourself. Why don't you stop? You've gone far enough. And Elisha says, I'm not leaving. I'm going to keep on going. And it must have encouraged the heart of that old prophet. Every Elijah hopes for an Elisha. All over this country, there are churches that are built by great men. Those men have turned those works over to younger men that talked the talk but didn't walk the walk. They turned that church in a new direction and dropped their standards and changed their position on the Bible. And the old man has to stand on the sideline. And his heart is breaking to watch a work that he poured his life into being destroyed by a martyrist. Every Elijah hopes there's an Elisha standing in the winds to carry the mantle when he's gone. In this story, every ministry has an expiration point. And every Elijah hopes for an Elisha. But thirdly, every Elisha hears experts that discourage him. Would you come back to verse number 3 with me? The sons of the prophets that were at Bethel came forth to Elisha and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Lord will take away thy master from thy head today? And he said, Yea, I know it. Hold ye your peace. Sons of the prophets, they're mentioned 9 times in the Old Testament. We suppose they are young men that are studying for the ministry. These are young men who I suppose have surrendered to the call to preach, and we hope that they'll have a ministry soon. You never read anything that the sons of the prophets do. You never read of any miracles they perform. Elisha, if you'll study it, Elisha has been following Elijah for 10 years. 10 years. And here are the sons of the prophets to discourage him. And here's what they're saying to him. They're saying, Elisha, you put all your chips in on Elijah. And everybody knows that today's his last day. He hasn't promoted you. He hasn't given you the mantle. He hasn't promised you anything. A lot of good it did you to be a servant for 10 years. And the sons of the prophet show up 4 times in this story, and all 4 times they have something discouraging to say. And every young man who has surrendered his life to Christ has had some expert in his ear to tell him that he can't do it. And sometimes the discouragement comes from your worst enemy. Sometimes the discouragement can come from your best friend. You'll never be a good preacher. You'll never raise that amount of support. I don't think that you can make it on deputation. You're never going to get into that prison. They don't have one word of encouragement. Listen, tomorrow, Elisha, you're going to be on your own, and I don't think that you're going to make it. Elisha, you're no Elijah. I don't think your shoulders are broad enough. I don't think you have it in you. You'll never be as good a prophet as Elijah. Every young man has to hear it. But look at something. Look at verse number 7. And 50 men of the sons of the prophet went and stood to a view afar off. They're content to stand afar off to see what's going to happen. And they watch Elijah take that mantle and smite the waters of the Jordan River. And watch this. 50 stand afar off, but they too stood by Jordan. And Elijah took his mantle and wrapped it together, smote the waters. They were divided hither and thither, so that they too went over on dry ground. It should say that 50 went over. Can we come over? Can we be a part of this? But the crowd that is content to stand afar off with their noses in this air, discouraging anybody that wants to do anything for God, they'll never cross over Jordan and see what that young man saw. You have some men are so busy in the work that they want help, and they'll encourage you and try to help you along, but the critic, the only thing that he finds time to do is criticize anything that you're trying to do. There are men who criticize Rock of Ages prison ministry, but they've never been in a prison to preach. I've had men to tell me how to pastor and how I wasn't doing it right. They never pastored a day in their life. It's easy to get on Twitter and pick apart your sermon, but they never wrote a sermon. I've had people email me, text me, and critique one word in a sermon. One word. Well, did I get any words right? Did I happen to stumble upon any truth what I was preaching? Huh? I've made a lot of mistakes in pastoring. I've had a couple of successes, but there are some who will never encourage you in the successes. And I just say tonight that if you determine to follow Jesus and to answer the call and to invest your life in ministry and in other people, there's going to be experts who are going to criticize you every step of the way. Every ministry has an expiration point. And every Elijah hopes for an Elisha to carry the mantle. And every Elisha hears experts that says you can't do it. But in spite of all of that, every Christian should hunger for an extra portion. Would you look at verse 9? It came to pass when they were gone over that Elijah said unto Elisha, ask what I should do for thee before I be taken away from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. A double portion. Elisha, I don't want to just do what you've done. I want to do more. I don't want just the same power that you had. I want more. I don't want just the same works I've seen you do. I want more. I don't want just the passion for God that you had. I want more. I've heard it preached so many times. I don't know if I've ever had a satisfactory answer as to why he's asking for more. It sounds a little bit selfish. I don't think that's intended here. I don't think he's saying I want a bigger ministry and a bigger building just for the sake of a bigger name. So why did he ask for a double portion? Could it be that Elisha realized that it's going to be harder, not easier? Did you know it's harder to knock on doors now than it was 20 years ago? Did you know it's harder to pass out tracts today than it was 20 years ago? Did you know it's harder to build a church now than it was 20 years ago? It's harder to raise support now than it was 20 years ago. And if you're going to do a work for God, it won't be enough just to have what the older generation had. You're going to need more. We stand in this building tonight in these grounds and we think about the giants that have stood in this building and they have preached the power of God. And here's what the cry is. Oh God, give me what you gave Moody. Give me what you gave Sankey. Give me what you gave Torrey. But in truth, we need more. Not content to just have the same. Would we dare to say, God, I want a double portion. I have 3 children, 4 grandchildren, 1 on the way. It's going to be harder for them to read their Bible. It's going to be harder for them to pray. It's going to be harder for them to stay true to Christ. They're going to face challenges and pressures that I never had to deal with, and they don't need just my resolve. They need more. They don't need my passion for God. They need more. They don't need to just copy Daddy's convictions. No, they need more. I try to pastor a church and preach a few meetings and direct a printing ministry, and I have suffering people in my church, and there are people that are calling me and they're asking for help, and I have families who've sent to the mission field and they're counting on me to hold the ropes back home, and I'll stand in my pulpit on Sunday and there's people sitting in that congregation that are walking through some very dark, deep valleys right now, and they hope that I've been with God this week and I've got something to say to them that will help them. And I've got 4 little grandchildren who think that Poppy hung the moon, and I want them them to get saved and love Jesus. And so I say, God, I need more. I need more of your power, and I need more of your touch, and I need more of your feeling, and to whatever measure you poured your Spirit out upon man, would you do it more for me? To whatever measure you've allowed one of your preachers to preach with the power of God, would you do more for me, for the sake of my church, and for the sake of my children, and for the sake of my family, and for the sake of God's glory? Would you give me more? Do you hunger tonight for an extra portion? Are you content with what you have? Is this enough? Do you have all of the power of God that you need? Has your ministry reached all that you want? Have you seen as many saved as you care to see? What would you say, Lord, I want more. I hunger for an extra portion. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. I wonder if there's some preacher in this room that would say, God, I want more. I want more of your touch, more of your power, more of your feeling, for the sake of my family, for the sake of my children, for the sake of the ministry. Would you give me more? Would you fill me with your power? Would you fill me with your Spirit? I hunger for an extra portion. Our Heavenly Father, touch these men and their wives and their children, the ministries that they've embarked upon. And I pray that you empower them, that you fill them, that you anoint them. Our generation is not getting better, it's getting worse. Our world is not drawing to you, they're drawing away from you. More pressures, more challenges that my children will face that I never had to face. They don't need just my conviction, they need more. They don't need to hear about my answers to prayer, they need their own tonight. So I pray tonight for your power, for your feeling, for your touch. We can't do anything without you. I pray that you would give us more.